Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Trudy Cox, and I'm the Director and CEO of the Preservation Society. And we are thrilled to have Michael Hiltzik with us tonight. He is a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's a reporter and writer with the LA Times. And his book, just recently published, is Iron Empires: Robber Barons, Railroads, and the Making of Modern America. I can't think of anything more perfect for Newport, Rhode Island. But before I introduce Michael, I want to remind everyone of several upcoming virtual events. We have an event on Tuesday, October 30th. It is at 9:30 in the morning because our speaker is from Sweden. He is the executive director of the Zorn Museum. Anders Zorn, a phenomenal portraitist and painter. And Johan Sederlund, the director of the Zorn, is going to be giving us a virtual tour of the Zorn Museum and talking about Anders Zorn's work. And he is a phenomenal speaker, so I encourage you all to join us 9:30 on October 30th. Let us know if you are interested in being part of that. And then our next lecture is on November 5th, Thursday night, 5:30. Maureen Montgomery, who is an adjunct associate professor in history from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and she will be discussing English country houses in Edith Wharton's last novel, The Buccaneers. So another perfect lecture for Newport. And again, we hope you will register. You can go online to do that. And we also encourage you to, before it closes, visit Rosecliff to see the exhibit Becoming Vanderbilt, which features 4 phenomenal Vanderbilt women. That is open on Thursdays and Fridays from 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and Saturdays and Sundays from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock. And we hope you will visit. That is at Rosecliff. We are going to have questions and answers. I suspect there will be a lot for Michael tonight. Leslie Jones, our Director of Museum Affairs, is going to handle the questions and answers. You saw her last week if you attended. She is a brand new mother of a 3.5-month-old baby, and we got introduced to Vaughn last week. So she will handle the questions and answers. And now it is my really great privilege to introduce Michael Hiltzik, who is a well-known author and writer. But more importantly to me, I knew Michael when he was a reporter with the Providence Journal. And that was about 30-some years ago. Well, he left the Providence Journal to go to the LA Times in 1981. So we have known each other for a long time, but we have not seen each other. And I'm very fond of him, and I'm very fond of his writing. Great reporter. At the LA Times, he has covered everything from financial and political issues. He's been an investigative reporter. He has covered technology. He has been an editor. He has been a foreign correspondent in Africa and in Russia. And he has 3 books, other than tonight's book, under his belt. I'm going to read these to you. Big Science, Ernest Lawrence, and the Invention That Launched the Military-Industrial Complex, which was written in 2015. The New Deal, A Modern History, written in 2011. And the New York Times bestseller, Colossus, Hoover Dam and the Making of the American Century, from 2010. We are so honored to have you. And I just want to throw in too, Michael has a fondness for Rhode Island. But what I really appreciate is that he didn't charge us. We are selling his book, and that was very kind of him because he could charge a big speaker's fee and he didn't do it. And so we really appreciate that. His book is for sale in our stores. So if you are in Newport, you can pick the book up at our stores, and you can pick it up in bookstores around the country. So Michael, thank you very much for being with us, and keep up your good work.
Well, thanks so much, Trudy. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here to speak with this group. So thank you all for coming remotely this evening. I'd love to be able to reach out and touch you all, but we're going to let, I guess, technology substitute for human contact, which is the fix we've been in for 6 or 8 months already. But I suppose it's appropriate in the way, since one of the themes of my book is, and our talk this evening, is how new technology in an earlier era brought Americans together in a manner that most people had no idea would ever happen. It came upon the country fairly suddenly, but it had a huge impact for decades and decades to come. So I want to thank right off the Preservation Society and my old friend Trudy and all of you for hosting the event, which, as Trudy mentioned, it brings me back to my relative youth when I was a reporter for the Providence Journal. And this is going to give me an opportunity to talk, among many other things, about the fortune behind the Breakers and Marble House, which was assembled by one of the most uncouth tycoons that this nation has ever produced. And that man, of course, was Cornelius Vanderbilt, the original Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore. But he's just one of the colorful and entertaining and, to some extent, frightful and frightening personalities who populate my book, which is subtitled Robber Barons, Railroads, and the Making of Modern America. And I hope that subtitle gives you all a clue to how I feel about these individuals, that many of them were scoundrels. None of them was entirely free of scoundreldom, to coin a word, but their legacy was greater than their character. For the industry they built in the last third of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century really did make the America that we live in today. And I'm going to talk about their environment too, the period that Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner christened as the Gilded Age, and which we might think of today as the first Gilded Age, because we've been living through an era with features and flaws and characteristics that replicate those of American society more than 100 years ago. But as Mark Twain is thought to have said, although this might be apocryphal, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often does rhyme. So let's get started. Here is the Commodore. Oops. Let me ratchet back here. Here's the Commodore, looking rather distinguished, even elegant, for a pen and ink illustration for an illustrated journal of his time. In this portrait, he's probably in his 70s, which means he was enjoying at least his second fortune. He had made the first in the steamboat business, plying the waters of the Hudson River from Hoboken, New Jersey, up to Albany. And why New Jersey? Well, the reason was that New York had awarded a steamboat monopoly on the Hudson to Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston, the owners of the Claremont. And the New York authorities didn't have the right to cross the river to New Jersey to enforce it. So all that Vanderbilt really had to do was dodge the New Yorkers when he was on the water, which he was able to achieve through guile and superior seamanship. The Vanderbilts of a later time were the epitome of high society, but that's not true of the founder of the fortune. Even as a youth, as his first biographer reported, the future Commodore, quote, was not blessed with popular manners. He was not conciliatory, never seemed to care what people thought or said of him. He was not choice of his language. He was sometimes harsh, abrupt, unceremonious, and even uncivil. Or as a later historian of Wall Street put it, Vanderbilt displayed, quote, the upbringing of a wharf rat. But he did win popular acclaim as a businessman by undercutting fares on the river and thus breaking the New Yorkers' monopoly, which the public saw as a great benefit, at least until Vanderbilt, having driven away his competition, started behaving like a monopolist himself. Now, this Vanderbilt was uncompromising when he thought he had been wronged in business. That side of his character emerged during the gold rush. Vanderbilt had sent a steamer south to transport 49ers across Lake Nicaragua in Central America, which shortened the journey from the East Coast to California by 600 miles and allowed him to undercut the prevailing fares by half. Well, he sold the Nicaragua service a few years later to a group of investors who unwisely refused to pay him what they owed him. Vanderbilt disdained taking them to court and wrote them instead, "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I will ruin you." And so he did by launching another competing steamer fleet and driving them into bankruptcy. Yet for all his ferocity in business, Vanderbilt harbored a curious soft spot in his heart for his most tenacious rival, and that was a saturnine character named Daniel Drew. And here's Drew. Drew had owned and piloted a steamboat on the Hudson in competition with Vanderbilt, but his real skill was as a swindler. Over time, Drew would earn a reputation as one of the great manipulators of Wall Street in a period when the almost complete lack of regulation or transparency gave full scope to the most piratical instincts of speculators. Drew was an expert in cloaking his swindler's instincts behind a conspicuous display of piety. He rarely missed a Sunday in church or was seen in public without a well-thumbed prayer book in hand. On Wall Street, he was known familiarly as Uncle Daniel, a token of grudging admiration for his ability to combine outward sanctimony with inner deviousness. Those who mistook him for a country deacon, as one of his contemporaries said, did so to their misfortune. It was a rare business partner who at one point or another failed to discover that Drew, at the same time he was urging him to buy a stock destined to soar, was selling the same shares short and driving their price down to the seller. The best illustration of Drew's twofold character and up and down career was Drew Theological Seminary, which he founded in 1867 as a training institute for Methodist ministers with an ostentatious pledge of $500,000 at a time when he was riding high. 13 years later, he died penniless, leaving $250,000 of the pledge unpaid. Drew Seminary, by the way, still exists today as Drew University, although in its history, it plays down the character of its founder. So over their careers, which were almost exactly contemporary, Drew would play the role sometimes of Vanderbilt's rival, sometimes his partner, sometimes his instrument in one of Vanderbilt's own schemes. When Drew was strapped, he sometimes came to Vanderbilt to plead abjectly for help, and Vanderbilt helped out almost every time, even when he had been the target of Drew's swindles, until the last time when Drew was on his deathbed, and the Commodore was then 2 years in the grave. It was never clear what Vanderbilt saw in Drew. Perhaps he recognized a man who had risen like himself from modest circumstances to command a fortune. Perhaps he was amused by Drew's relentless pursuit of profit, whatever the underlying treachery. But what was most curious about their relationship was that they took diametrically divergent approaches to the railroad business, which they entered almost simultaneously in the 1860s. Drew saw opportunity for profit not in building and operating railroads per se, but in speculating in railroad paper, that is, in stocks and bonds. His first ventures in this field came through the Erie Railroad, one of the first long-distance lines in the East, which was built to carry coal from Western Pennsylvania to markets in New England and in the mid-Atlantic states. Finagling himself a seat on the Erie's board, he exploited inside information by buying up stock when he knew conditions were good, selling it when he knew they were bad, profiting by relentlessly working against the interests of his own railroad. Vanderbilt, on the other hand, recognized that the way to make lasting profits in the railroad industry was by building good railroads and running them efficiently. His first venture was the Harlem Railroad, which had just expanded beyond Manhattan and into Westchester County. The line had fallen victim to the common ailments of American railroads of the era, looted by dishonest and incompetent executives, operating without credit, physically decrepit. The stock was trading at 3 cents a share in 1862 and finding no takers. until Vanderbilt. To him, not only did the shares seem alluringly cheap, but the potential for improving the enterprise seemed limitless. The Harlem would provide Vanderbilt with his first opening to put into practice a set of precepts for railroad management that he summarized as follows. Number one, buy your railroad. Number two, stop the stealing that went on under the other man. Number three, improve it in every practicable way within a reasonable expenditure. And number four, make it pay a large dividend to yourself. In time, Vanderbilt would control railroads on both sides of the Hudson, as well as the New York Central and lines stretching out toward Chicago. He was America's first railroad monopolist. Now, it makes sense to pause here and talk about the railroad industry of this era more generally. Railroads were America's first big business. Prior to the Civil War, the largest business enterprises in America were the textile mills of New England. The largest of those, the Pepperell Mills of Biddeford, Maine, had annual expenditures larger than $300,000 only once during the 1850s. In 1855, however, the cost of operating the Erie reached $2.8 million. The Pepperell Mills employed 800 laborers at its peak. By the 1880s, the Pennsylvania Railroad's workforce numbered 50,000. Railroad tycoons became the first business leaders to acquire social and cultural cachet. They would be lionized as a new American aristocracy, more so since they held their positions not by chance of birth, but by the exercise of intelligence and will. The railway kings are among the greatest men, perhaps I may say, are the greatest men in America. That was the judgment of Viscount James Bryce, a Scottish diplomat whose 1888 book, The American Commonwealth, became a bestseller. Bryce wrote, "When the master of one of these great lines travels on his palace car, his journey is like a royal progress. Governors of states and territories bow before him. Legislatures receive him in solemn session. Cities and towns seek to propitiate him, for has he not the means of making or marring a city's fortunes?" And Bryce was right about that. A railroad owner could turn a backwater hamlet into a thriving metropolis simply by bringing his railroad into town, or reduce it to a footnote to history by leaving it unserved. Now, to less respective observers than Bryce, there was something fundamentally suspect about these industrialists, which is why they became known as robber barons. That was a term first applied to Vanderbilt and then more generally to all the railroad presidents. They were rich and powerful, yet there was a suspicion that there was something unsavory in how they came by their wealth. And this notion, as it happened, was true, although the truth would not become proven for many years to come. That said, we can't overlook the impact that the railroads had on American life and the development of the country, especially as they made their way westward. Here, for example, is a famous map showing the difficulty of traversing the vast continental United States in 1857, more than a decade before the first Transcontinental Railroad. As you can see, in that era, railroads were pretty well built out in the Northeast and along the Atlantic seaboard. One could get from New York to, say, Newport, Rhode Island in less than a day, to Chicago in 2 days, and Omaha in 6 or 7. But after that, however, you were on your own. You were traveling overland, and it would take as long as 3 weeks to reach Denver, a month to reach San Francisco, and 6 weeks to make it as far as Seattle. The Transcontinental Railroad, which connected up in May 1869, shortened the last of that traversal by 2 weeks or more. Now this was, as you can probably imagine, a major event in American life at the time. At the driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit, Utah on May 10th, connecting the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, and here, by the way, is one of the more famous photographs of that moment, the so-called champagne photo. At that moment, a telegrapher was on hand to transmit to the world that the Golden Spike had been driven to unite the Union Pacific and Central Pacific. At 12:47 p.m. local time in Promontory, May 10th, 1869, he tapped out the word "done." Celebrations immediately broke out from coast to coast. In San Francisco, every fire bell in the city was struck to mark, quote, a victory over space, the elements, and the stupendous mountain barriers separating the East from the West, as the San Francisco Bulletin declared. 100 cannons boomed in New York's City Hall Park. But the adventure was just beginning. So we were still in the age of scoundrels. As my book details, during the 1870s and 1880s, the railroad industry was still in the grasp of stock manipulators. People like Jay Gould and his flamboyant partner, Jim Fisk, a couple of speculators out of Boston who seemed to engage in one suspect scheme after another. At one point, they tried to corner the gold market by bribing an in-law of President U.S. Grant for inside information about Grant's economic policies. Their scheme failed, but somehow, and typically, Gould and Fisk came out of it with a profit, while the investors who were their targets were ruined. At another stage, Gould and Fisk ended up owning the Erie Railroad, which had earlier been manipulated so ruthlessly by Daniel Drew. In the interim, the railroad had been bought and sold so wantonly that it became known as the Scarlet Woman of Wall Street. Gould and Fisk, by the way, were a sort of Mutt and Jeff pair on Wall Street. Gould, who you can see here, was the mastermind of all their schemes, the brains of the duo, but a quiet, personally unassuming individual who spent every night at home with his wife and children. Then there was Fisk, Mr. Outside to Gould's Mr. Inside. Gould never gave an interview, but newspaper reporters knew that they would never be able to get Fisk to shut up. He swanked around town in a glittery uniform, calling himself Admiral Fisk, always with a woman on his arm, and here he is in his glory. Jay Gould would die in his bed, much to the displeasure of the investors who thought he had cheated them, of tuberculosis in 1892. Fisk had been shot to death on a hotel staircase by the lover of his mistress 20 years earlier. He had hung on overnight before expiring, while his gambling cronies traded $100 wagers over how long he would survive the bullet. Anyway, by the 1880s, the entire railroad industry was in a bad way. It was a mishmash of small and medium-sized lines that competed fiercely and unscrupulously with one another. Coordination and cooperation were almost non-existent. Railroads whose routes connected with each other didn't work out joint schedules, so passengers and freight reaching the end of one line would have to wait hours, sometimes even days, to be picked up and carried onward. The lines were built on different gauges, that is, the distance between the rails, so that locomotives and cars built for one line couldn't travel on the next. Some lines had been built for no purpose whatsoever other than to engage in a rate war with a parallel road, the goal being to goad the owner of the original line into buying out the newcomer. Clearly, something had to change. The industry needed to be organized and rationalized. Pointless competition was sapping the entire industry's financial strength, exasperating the European investors whose capital was crucial, to the point that word came back to the US that an American railroad bond could not be sold in London or Paris, even if it were, and I quote, signed by an angel in heaven. The word on the street was that the railroad industry needed a Bismarck. That was a reference to the chancellor who had brought together a welter of small competing duchies in Germany to create the powerful Prussian Empire. And the man who seemed destined to take on that role in the railroad industry was J. Pierpont Morgan. So, a few words about Pierpont Morgan. Many of you are probably familiar with this classic photograph of Morgan by Edward Steichen, showing him gripping the arm of his chair, lit so that it looks like a dagger in his hand. His eyes glaring as though he's about to dress down a recalcitrant railroad president. I want you to drink that in for a minute because I'm about to show you my own personal favorite photograph of J.P. Morgan in the wild. To appreciate it, you have to know that Morgan was famous for hating newspaper reporters, never allowing them to interrupt his lifestyle or his work. Yet one day he was waylaid on the street by a newspaper photographer, and this encounter ensued. As you can see, he's raising his cane to strike the cameraman, thus ensuring that the image will get published coast to coast and enter history. It may be, by the way, that one reason Pierpont hated to have his picture taken was that people would be able to see his most salient physical feature, a red, bulbous, misshapen nose caused by a skin condition. And you'll notice that Steichen quite tactfully airbrushed that condition out of existence in his photograph. The Morgan family firm had been founded to help wealthy Europeans find suitable investments in the United States. By the 1860s, it had become clear that the railroad industry was going to have an insatiable appetite for capital, and therefore the Morgans needed to become experts in that business. Junius Morgan, the founder of the House of Morgan, assigned his son Pierpont to that task. So in July 1869, Pierpont, his wife Fanny, and several relatives set out to take one of the first rides on the new Intercontinental Railroad from east to west. Fanny, as it happened, left a detailed account of the trip written in pencil in a series of palm-sized notebooks, which I was able to examine at the Morgan Library in New York. Fanny's diaries describe the privations experienced on long-distance rail, even by one of the wealthiest families in the country. The Morgan party made it as far as Chicago in just a few days, then set off for Omaha to begin their transcontinental journey in reality. They crossed rickety bridges over rushing rivers, sometimes had to debark to be ferried through swamps as the train was hauled to the other side, and they ate meals at trackside restaurants so monotonous that it was necessary to look at one's watch to tell whether it was breakfast, dinner, or supper that we were eating, as Fanny wrote. But the landscape was glorious. Herds of antelopes scampering away from the tracks, magnificent sunsets like scarlet and golden fire, Fanny wrote, the distant Rockies like a glimpse of the Alps, all whitened with snow. The party debarked at a stop in Utah to take a side trip over 30 miles of dusty and bumpy road to Salt Lake City, a mysterious place populated by people mysterious to these visitors from the East. To their surprise, they found the territory to be a wilderness turned into a Garden of Eden by Mormon irrigation and manpower. They visited with Brigham Young, who seemed to take a fancy to Fanny's sister Mary, provoking giggles about whether she might become one of his wives. She would have become his 54th wife by some reckonings. The Morgan party returned to their depot again over a bumpy, rocky road to discover that their train would be 7 hours late. Finally, they reached Sacramento, which was as far west as the Central Pacific reached. From there, they had to board boats to make it the rest of the way to San Francisco. So Pierpont returned east with a greater sense of the importance of the rail links between the Eastern Seaboard and Chicago, but the journey left him with a long-lasting disdain for the Union Pacific, born of weeks of uncomfortable travel over incompetent track laid through a vacant wasteland devoid of productive capacity or commercial demand. But this was an unduly pessimistic impression of the Union Pacific's potential and arguably the costliest misjudgment J.P. Morgan made in his life. And that's because his error would not come back to hurt him until the emergence many years hence of the only man on earth who would challenge him for power and influence over the economic life of the United States. And that brings us to the other main character of my book, Edward H. Harriman. Unlike Morgan, Harriman was not born to wealth. His father was an itinerant preacher who spent his life on a long trajectory to poverty. Ned Harriman, however, inherited a powerful intelligence and ambition from his mother. At 14, he quit school and found a job as a pad shover on Wall Street, one of an army of youths employed in carrying from office to office notebooks on which the latest prices of securities were scribbled. Yet from the start, Ned Harriman displayed a preternatural grasp of the securities business and the ambition to make the most of his talents. At the age of 22, he borrowed $3,000 from an uncle and bought himself a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. Soon, he entered the railroad industry through the good offices of a friend named Stuyvesant Fish and the family of a young lady from upstate New York he had met while she was visiting her own relatives briefly in New York City. Her name was Mary Averill, and the couple's elder son, Averill Harriman, would later become governor of New York. Harriman's railroad career was both a throwback to Vanderbilt and a pointer to the future, for he saw, as the Commodore had, that the path to success in railroads was in building them better than the competition. He was a fascinating character, now no longer as well known as I think he should be. He was serious about railroad building. When he acquired a road, he would virtually walk its length on foot, taking in every aspect of its construction and divining where it could be improved. He projected a coldness to the outside world in business, but somehow attracted friends from all walks of life, from the eminent financier Otto Kahn to John Muir, the famous naturalist, who Harriman invited along on a scientific expedition to Alaska, an expedition that produced a detailed report of the flora and fauna of that still remote territory in 8 volumes, now deposited in the Smithsonian Institution archives, where they're still consulted by students and experts to this very day. And that, I think, is an indication of the different personalities of Harriman and Morgan. Pierpont, when he took a vacation from Wall Street, headed to Europe to collect paintings and objets d'art for his personal collection. Harriman collected scientists and engineers and led them personally on an expedition to Alaska. By the turn of the century, Harriman was the most important railroad figure in the nation other than Morgan, and even more ambitious. As the Interstate Commerce Commission would say of him, it is only the law which prevents the concentration into Mr. Harriman's hands of every railroad line lying between Canada and Mexico. That was true, and that law was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been enacted in 1890. Now, I'm going to skip over the epic quest that pitted E.H. Harriman and J.P. Morgan against one another in what seemed for a time to be a battle to the death for control of the American railroad industry. And that's because it's the climax of my book, and I don't want to deprive you all of the pleasure of reading it in detail. But suffice to say that the fight was so fierce and so ferocious that it crashed the New York Stock Exchange during 1 week in May 1901. Instead, I want to spend the last few minutes of my talk in describing the general atmosphere in which these robber barons operated, and that is the Gilded Age. They congregated in New York, and their money essentially moved the center of gravity of the US economy to New York from Philadelphia. And there they engaged in a competitive display of ostentation that was not to be replicated until our own time. In the last few years of the 19th century, the institutions they founded, the edifices they built, and the social affairs they sponsored symbolized high society. There was the Waldorf Astoria, a grand hotel that originally occupied the site that's now occupied by the Empire State Building. The hotel originated as two hotels, the Waldorf and the Astoria, built at opposite corners of the block by two feuding Astor cousins. When the hotels were united under single management, they were linked by an ornate corridor known as Peacock Alley, along which wealthy patrons would promenade to show off their finery. At the Astoria end of Peacock Alley was the Palm Room, where diners were required to wear formal attire, men in white tie and women in evening gowns. And here's the Palm Room. Of course, this was the era in which Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the Commodore's grandson, built the breakers of his country as his country cottage, and his brother William K. Vanderbilt erected Marble House. Cornelius II, as you may know, was the grandfather of Gloria Vanderbilt, who was known as the poor little rich girl, and that makes him the great-grandfather of CNN's Anderson Cooper, her son. Anyway, it was New York that remained the center of high society. In my book, I tell the story of the most elegant, elaborate, glittering social event at the end of the 19th century, the Bradley Martin Ball, held at the Waldorf on February 10th, 1897, almost literally a fin de siècle moment. The Bradley Martin Ball was a costume party, and here is Mrs. Bradley Martin dressed as Mary, Queen of Scots. The gala event, the newspaper said, was a once-in-a-generation affair, an entertainment so stupendous in scope and sumptuous in detail that it marks an epoch in the history of society. 900 guests attended. 60 cases of French champagne were delivered to the Waldorf, and 6,000 mauve orchids. 200 policemen were stationed outside the hotel under the personal supervision of New York's police commissioner, Theodore Roosevelt. But the timing of the Bradley Martin Ball was inauspicious, for the ostentation of the Gilded Age had already come into disrepute. Another panic in 1893, the second panic in 20 years, and like the first, blamed on the railroads and their shaky finances. That the 1893 panic had ruined thousands of businesses and put tens of thousands of workers out on the street. Labor unrest was spreading, much of it aimed at that largest American industry, the railroads. Discontent over the conspicuous spending of the nation's new industrial aristocracy had been building for years. The Bradley Martin Ball merely served as the last straw. It did not help that the source of much of the new wealth were railroads, for they also had become transformed in the public mind from technological marvels and economic boons into rapacious, heartless juggernauts. Their builders and owners no longer were seen as industrial kings, but as buccaneers and cheats. The era was changing, more so with the elevation of then Vice President Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency with the assassination of William McKinley in September 1901. McKinley had been a rock-ribbed pro-business Republican, but his vice president was something else, a progressive who supported labor and was skeptical of the tycoons. The Republicans had put Roosevelt on the ticket as vice president to neuter him, but now he was president. He then gave a famous speech in which he damned the, quote, malefactors of great wealth, chief among whom was Harriman, who may have been singled out because he had been a friend of Roosevelt's until they suffered a bitter personal split. Teddy Roosevelt termed himself the trust buster, and the first trust he busted as president was the one that Harriman and Morgan had created to settle their differences after that 1901 crash, the Northern Securities Trust. And here's how Teddy Roosevelt was depicted in the popular press as the trust buster. And there he is, the trust buster, sending the malefactors of great wealth packing with Morgan and Harriman right there at the front of the parade. All these tycoons are carrying signs reading, "Only seafood for 7 weeks," and "Pity the poor banker," and "No place to go but the Waldorf." The robber barons were the 1% of their time, and their era and that of the Iron Empires was coming to an end. And with that, I'll bring my talk to an end with the thought that for all their speculation and manipulation and chicanery, the robber barons did create the foundation for modern America. They created a great industry. They brought into being business management methods that are still in use today, and they bound together as one nation, a nation that had been sundered by the Civil War. And with that, I will close and open the floor to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was absolutely fantastic. It's clear that you have spent a lot of time researching this subject, and we're so, again, grateful that you were able to share with us this evening. Again, I want to say, hopefully you all can see, we have the book. The book is also available in our stores at Bannister's Wharf and at the Breakers, as well as online. So we hope that if you're interested in buying it, please do visit the Newport Mansion shops to make your purchase. We have a lot of great questions coming in. Please feel free to send them in the Q&A box. It's at the bottom of your screen. To begin with, one of our questions, from your 1857 map of the cross-continental traversing, can you share with us what the experience of railroad travel would have been like?
Yes, as the Morgans experience, it was to people who were used to traveling overland and actually not used to traveling long distances, it was an extraordinary experience. The first travelers on medium length railroads were going at 25 miles an hour, and they thought that was unimaginably swift. But it was smoky, hot. It was not especially comfortable. As I said, when you traversed from one line to the next, sometimes you had to wait days, sometimes hours. When you came off the car to have a meal at one of these roadside restaurants, you had to keep your eye on the train you had left, because sometimes they would start to pull out without announcing that they were doing so to all the patrons, and they had to scurry to take their places again. This began to change with the advent of the Pullman Palace car, which were, these were the first cars that would actually have berths that you could pull down from the ceiling or fold out from the beginning. Pullman made his own fortune by building these palace cars, and by the way, was such a rapacious individual himself. He fomented one of the greatest strikes of that era in 1888, the Pullman strike, which brought us Eugene V. Debs, who was a leader of the railroad union that started the strike. But at any event, to us, of course, it would be unbearable. To the travelers of that time, it was not particularly comfortable, but more exciting than anything they had thought to experience up to then.
Interesting, because we also have a great comment here that Jay Gould's train parlor cars were and maybe still are part of the dining room at the Madison Hotel in Morristown, New Jersey. And our commenter has dined there, and they were quite opulent, apparently. So it seems things continue to progress, and it's quite elegant. And I'm assuming as well, majority of the passengers, of course, that we're speaking about were very wealthy or middle class to elite white people. Was there segregation on the trains?
Well, the train, the railroads were never actually accomplished at racial equality. In fact, there were many stories of Black passengers being thrown off the train because the conductors couldn't believe that they had, say, a first-class ticket, even though they were displaying it. But in terms of the passengers in general, yes, you had rich families traveling for sightseeing, but most of them, most of the passengers were in fact future settlers. The railroads, when they were being built, particularly across the prairie, they were funded by the government with the cession of tracts of land the government gave them, and the idea being the railroads uh, would facilitate settling of this land by farmers and ranchers, so that the railroads would have produce and goods to carry from one coast to another. So at various points, the railroads would have recruiters on the docks in New York or along the eastern seaboard who would waylay immigrants from Europe, give them passage to the interior, and offer them access to land at a very cheap rate if they would only till that land and create, basically create cargo. If that's why in the Midwest of this country, we find communities and territory that's been settled by German Lutherans and Scandinavians and what have you. And that's because those were groups that came west to make their way in the new country.
Interesting. That's fascinating. And in the expansion of our country as well, how the railroads are so integrally tied into that.
The railroads really were the colonizers of the interior of the country.
Fascinating. Interesting question here. Given the railroad's money and power, how did the Sherman Antitrust Act ever pass? How could it have been enforced, or was it?
Well, the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Act, which was enacted a little bit earlier, the railroads exercised their influence by making sure that these acts were not nearly as enforceable as they could have been. And that's especially true of the ICC. And in fact, throughout history, even to this day, the Sherman Antitrust Act is usually not very well enforced. Sometimes we have an administration that really wants to use the Sherman Act as well as it can. Generally not, but during this period around the late 1880s and 1890s, disaffection with the railroads was so strong that even in Congress, even though Congress recognized the power of the railroads, they feared the wrath of the voters as well. So they enacted these laws in an effort, sort of a half-baked effort, to bring them under heel.
Interesting. And to that point, through your research you've written books on many subjects, as we know now from Trudy's introduction. Through your research for this particular topic, is there anything that really stuck out to you that's little known in American popular history culture, or otherwise that was individually interesting to you as you went through all of your process of bringing this publication together?
Well, certainly the degree to which the railroads affected society. Women started traveling on the railroad. For the first time, they were getting out of the house and traveling on their own. So there's a lengthy, sizable literature in which female travelers write with advice to the female travelers who might succeed them, how to carry themselves, what to watch out for, the dangers that they might encounter on the trip, dangers from other humans, not from wildlife or Indians. One of the most interesting episodes that I came across goes back to if any of you have seen or remember the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, you remember that early in the movie, Butch and Sundance rob a Union Pacific train. They're blocked for a while by a trainman who says he's been deputed by Mr. E.H. Harriman of the Union Pacific not to give up the safe, not to give up the money. Well, they blow up the safe anyway. Then they rob the train again on its return transit. And at that point, they discovered that Mr. E.H. Harriman has created a mobile team of law enforcers who come up in their own train car, and they're mounted on stallions that can travel 100 miles a day, and they chase Butch and Sundance across country. As it happens, that's a true story. Harriman did create this mobile group of law enforcement agents, and he did so because he was exasperated by repeated robberies on his trains, and he resolved to stop it. He did stop it. The Union Pacific under Harriman became known as the safest transcontinental railroad to ship yourself and your cargo on. And that was a great competitive advantage for the Union Pacific over the other transcontinental railroads, such as the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, which didn't make that investment.
Huh, fascinating. We have a lot of questions coming in about the construction of the railroads and the labor forces that were used and the supplies, and getting, if you're going to be building a railroad, how do you get those supplies to the middle of nowhere, essentially? And was wondering if you could speak to that as well.
Sure. Well, the main way to get supplies to the middle of nowhere was to transport them by rail. So the railroads were basically building themselves. The railroads' need for supplies and material created the steel industry. It created a market for timber from the Northwest for ties. The workers were known as boomers. These were fairly skilled workers who would go from railroad to railroad. They would build out a railroad as required, and then when that job was done, they would move on to the next. They were relatively well paid. They thought they had secure jobs, and they were right up until 1873, and again after 1893, when the economic slumps appeared, and the railroads, because of their financial structures, really thought they had no option to cut costs other than to lay these workers off or to cut their wages. And that created an era of extended labor unrest. The first national labor unions appeared during this time. They were centered on the railroads, and as I said, the American Railway Union, which started the strike against Pullman, which threatened to expand throughout the railroad industry, brought us Eugene V. Debs, who then had a decades and decades long career as an unsuccessful candidate for president on the socialist ticket.
Right. It's amazing how much of American life is touched by the development of the railroads, as you're describing as part of our answer, as well as your book outlines as well. So again, we encourage everyone to buy a copy of it. I think we're going to end on one last question, which segues perfectly. Can you say more about the lasting impact that these businesses may have had on management practices today, sort of bringing the past into the present?
Yeah, it was a very significant impact. As I pointed out during my talk, before the railroads came about, even the largest American enterprises were pretty local enterprises. They were single factories or maybe chains of factories. They didn't require a great deal of management sophistication, but that changed with the railroads. Not only were the railroads bigger, they employed thousands of people. Eventually, they needed to coordinate with one another. They needed to create schedules. They needed to figure out how to divvy up the markets they were in. And this created management methods that really have lasted to the present day, because the needs were so sophisticated and the demand was so sophisticated. So when you have a transnational enterprise or a multinational enterprise, you're really exploiting management techniques that were developed through the first part through the railroads. The railroads changed labor management relations really for all time for the same reason. So we see the impact of railroad management methodologies really up to the present day.
Fantastic. Michael, thank you so much. This has been such an enlightening lecture, and your question and answer session, again, still bringing more information to us. Iron Empires is the name of the book. Congratulations on the publication, and thank you again for giving us your time and the insight into all the work that you've done on this really interesting period of American history. Thank you,
Well,
everyone,
thank
for
you for giving me this opportunity. It's been great.
it's our pleasure wholly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. We hope to see you again. Again, next week on October 21st, we have the virtual tour of the Zorn Museum. And then again on November 5th, we have our next evening lecture program. So please be sure to check out our website, newportmansions.org. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a good night.